Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy so that you go off into each and every week with a little bit better preparation into the questions that face you. You've probably heard this story discussed a little bit in some of the news coverage. It hasn't gotten an awful lot of news coverage around the Commonwealth of Virginia. There's a case going in front of the Supreme Court now, fully vetted with all the justices, regarding affirmative action and Harvard. And a book out on that is written by Heather McDonald, political commentator with the Manhattan Institute, and the book is called The Diversity Delusion, and the Harvard Affirmative Action case is part of that delusion. Heather, welcome to the program. Thank you very much for taking some time out with us, and how are you doing today?
I'm great, Joe. Thank you for having me on.
Is this, and we've seen the issue in lots of other stories come up where the pushback against affirmative action has started to manifest. There are generations growing up where dads have made the excuse that their lack of achievement has been because of quotas, that they didn't get jobs because of quotas and things like that. And certainly we've seen the case in Texas where the quotas system, affirmative action cases have been questioned. Take a little bit in for our listeners if they haven't heard the story of what's going on and what's in front of the Supreme Court regarding Harvard and their admissions policies.
Well, the Harvard case is a very clever choice on the part of the plaintiffs, because it's targeted. The plaintiffs are not whites; they're Asians. Now, any type of reverse discrimination matters, but the defenders of these unconstitutional racial quotas have managed to play off of white guilt and say that, well, it doesn't matter if whites are being discriminated against when schools set vastly lower standards for admission for blacks and Hispanics, setting aside places that, if they were following academic standards, would go to more highly qualified Asians and whites. But this case is brought by Asians who are rightly incensed by the fact that they have to present magnitudes higher academic qualifications than blacks and Hispanics to even be considered for admission. And this is true in every selective school across the country. There's not a single school that does not have vast racial preferences. Blacks and Hispanics are admitted with objective academic scores. You know, these are non-biased criteria like the SATs or the ACTs that are 1 to 2 standard deviations below those of the white and Asian students. This is unfair, but my main concern with this ubiquitous regime of racial preferences is that it doesn't even help its alleged beneficiaries.
Exactly.
And in fact, it is contributing to racial divisions on campuses because students who are admitted with lower qualifications struggle to compete academically, and they end up blaming their struggles not on the fact that they were admitted with much, much lower preparation, but they are taught to think of themselves as victims of racism by the massive campus diversity bureaucracy, and they go around seeing racism where it doesn't exist, and this leads to the entire atmosphere we have on colleges today of victimization, complaint, and fake charges of oppression.
Heather, in Charlottesville, where we come from, where we flag from, there was just a story written in the New York Times a week or so ago about our high school system, and sent in by one of our students who's claiming that there are still statistically showing lack of achievement, and then basing this on the idea of, as you said, that there's some hidden racism inherent in the system. system to that. And I hear, as you're describing this is exactly what they're claiming now at sub the collegiate level. In our elementary and high school levels, we're hearing that this achievement gap is racially driven as well. Is this the fruit of what you're seeing in these college quota systems?
Well, sure. I mean, I saw that ridiculous Times article. It was one of their three-page spreads, that when they really go all in on claiming that America remains a systemically biased place, which is absurd. It actually managed for once to mention in passing the degree of the skills gap in Charlottesville, which is blacks are 3 grades behind whites on average, as opposed to nationwide blacks are two grades below. I mean, that's putting it optimistically. I mean, the data that I've seen says that the average black 12th grader reads at the level of a white 8th grader. So given those massive disparities in educational achievement, the entire diversity racket is based on a fiction. The way the diversity industry works is it looks at any given institution, and if there is not a proportional number of either females or so-called underrepresented minorities, that's a category that refers mostly in campus lingo to blacks and Hispanics, the conclusion follows for these diversicrats that institution is by definition racist and sexist. But when you have academic skills gaps of those magnitudes, it is preposterous to assume that every law firm or every engineering department, every high-tech firm in Silicon Valley or in Virginia is going to have 13% black employees, which is the national average, when you have students that are graduating that still can't read. They are not prepared to be at the top of their class in law school or to go into high competition STEM fields. This is not because of racism, that academic skills gap. This country has spent trillions on poverty programs since the 1960s. The schools have been funded up the gazoo. What's the cause of this is a culture that does not value academic achievement to the same extent that Asians do. I mean, they are whooping everybody's ass in this country because there is a monolithic, fanatical focus on studying, on doing your homework, on deferring gratification. The black culture, by contrast, has a millstone around its neck with this stigma against acting white, which is to do your homework, to pay attention in class. That is a very hard thing to overcome, and unless it is, these skills gaps are going to continue.
Well, it sounds to me like you've identified one of those things that has eluded me for some time, Heather, which is that idea that certainly the statistics, when you look at statistics, when nobody is arguing that these gaps exist, it's where do they come from? It's how does a high school graduate from the black community wind up needing to go back and learn how to read and do rudimentary algebra before they could go on into college, where somebody else is going out. And some of it is economics, and I believe those race profiteers is what I call them, but I love your comparison them to a racket, to an industry, because there is big money to run many of these nonprofit agencies that oversee and to look into this, and never mind the law firms that bill some considerable hours to watch over this stuff. That what really, as you said, is the sad part of this is there are young men and young women regardless of race, that are not learning to read, not learning all the things that would give them the opportunity to tap into the gifts God's given them, because we're not expecting them to. We're not asking them to. We're just saying, no, it's okay. You're going to graduate anyway because we need to make the spreadsheet balance out. Am I grasping what you're saying correctly?
Well, yes, that's definitely part of it, which is the culture at large makes excuses and does not have a single standard. I mean, we see that, that's what's at stake at the Harvard case, which is double standards everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Every college that is remotely selective is admitting blacks and Hispanics with much lower credentials, and is saying that this is necessary and it would be unfair to hold them to the same standards. So that broader excuse-making is playing into this. But what I was saying is that there's also a deficit, I think, in the urban culture, which is to stigmatize those students who are working hard and to tell them that they are simply emulating white behavior, and instead there is an ethic of anti-intellectualism that to be black is to not focus on academics, to focus on other things. And you can talk to teachers in inner city schools. They have a very hard time getting kids to do their homeworks, to take their books home, to study at night, and there just isn't the same attention. And that the fervent desire to succeed academically that the Asians have is something that we all should emulate. But it is very, very missing.
The book is just out. It's The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. It's just out in bookstores. Get it, download it. We'll put a link up to it as well. But do you find in your research for this that this is the fruit of, in some cases, 2 or 3 generations raised in this war on poverty? You mentioned beginning in the 60s, where the Great Society, almost ironically named, has actually created the least great society we could make, and in an effort to placate has actually, if I may use the phrase in its technical term, retarded the growth of all our communities under this idea that subsidies will come, and that's easier than the running the risk of it trying to achieve and not.
Well, that's true. There is a sense of why develop work ethic, why develop personal responsibility, because the government check is blind. I mean, we used to have in this culture back in the turn of the 20th century a unapologetic distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. And this was before big government aid and when you had private charity, and donors were very careful about not wanting to underwrite self-destructive behavior.
Sure.
But now, there is a considerable amount of racial guilt in this country for understandable reasons, and people think that they are doing good by lowering standards. The book focuses a lot on university culture, which I think is the source of a lot of poison that's coming into our culture at large. The hatred, the Kavanaugh hearings were a demonstration of the fact that we're all in Gender Studies 101. I mean, what we saw there with the contempt for due process, the mandate that any sexual assault claim must be believed unconditionally, that's just a direct import from the campus rape hysteria that has been convulsing campuses for the last decade or so, and promoting a false narrative of victimhood. So the universities, when it comes to race relations, are making things a lot worse because, again, they are telling students to see racism where none exists. Many minority students today claim that on a college campus they are victims of racism. This is absolutely preposterous.
Mm-hmm.
It's an outright lie, but it is one that is perpetuated by the adults on campus who tell students to think of themselves as victims. But the reason that the majority of Black and Hispanic students are on highly selective campuses is because the administrations want them so badly that they're admitting them with lower grades. This is not to say that Black and Hispanic students shouldn't go to college. They should go to college where what they're prepared for, and it's not just a race issue. Any type of preference is destructive. If MIT decided it needed more female undergraduates, and so it implemented gender quotas, which it probably does have, and it admitted me if I had a math SAT of 650 on an 800-point scale, and all my peers had been admitted on a meritocratic basis to MIT with 800 on their math SATs, I would flounder in my first year. I would not be able to keep up with freshman calculus or advanced calculus because it would be pitched to the average level of my peers, which would be much, much higher than I was prepared for. And I would likely be at the bottom of my classes, and given what we've seen with existing patterns, I would probably decide that I wasn't cut out for a major in a science field, whereas had I been admitted with my 650 math SAT, not to MIT, but let's say to Boston College, where my peers came in with a similar degree of preparation and the teaching in freshman calculus or first-year chemistry was pitched at our rates of knowledge, I would probably succeed and be able to major in chemistry. Well, the same thing happens with blacks who are admitted with academic skills, preparation, one or two standard deviations behind their peers. They can't keep up. They would have kept up if they had gone to any number of completely respectable schools that offer a decent education, but the preening adults on these highly selective schools are insistent on looking out over their diverse realm, and so they do injury to the people they admit with non-competitive skills.
And that's the saddest part of it, is the injury to the kids that are supposedly the beneficiaries of this, is that they're left by the side of the road as a statistical footnote, and that, okay, we got our quota met. What happens to them after that is really irrelevant. And really it goes back, and this is why I was tying it into, you mentioned preparation several times, because it's not an intellectual exercise as much as it is a preparational one, and societally and community-wise, we need to be doing a better job of preparing. But is there also a sense that this is also the fruit of expecting a government program to fix everything for you? I watch this in our communities. Whatever the fruit of it may be, that I voted for somebody and they're going to get me, better education or better health care, or, and it's not the function of a government official to get you better health care or better education or a college degree or anything like that. But we expect that for our vote these days.
Well, that's absolutely right. We have just ceded our own personal responsibility and realm of action to the government. There's been some interesting work done on different ethnic groups and the path they chose to advancement and power. And people like Nathan Glazer observed that some ethnic groups, like Asians, decided that their path to power was going to be to compete in the marketplace. And they basically ignored politics.
Yeah.
Whereas blacks have focused on political power, perhaps for understandable reasons, having been
denied it for many years. Had it removed from their possibility for so long.
Right.
As well. Is there part of this, and I see a dangerous at this point, as you mentioned, since the 60s, this idea of quotas, but now we're also coming to the point where a generation of college students are just entering campus having been told that participation is sufficient for a trophy, and I worry that some of this protest society we see is coming from kids who were told, no, just being here is good enough. Just showing up for the game is, everybody gets a trophy. We're not keeping score anymore. And they get into a world where score keeping is what happens, and they don't like it very much. And I worry that this is a volatile combination of these quotas plus a group of young people who, for the most part, have been told scores don't matter.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing instinct of, and I can't profess absolute knowledge as to why we thought it was a good thing to lower expectations across the board. We had the self-esteem movement that came out of California in the 1990s, therapeutic, saying that what matters is self-esteem regardless of whether you've earned it. And so people do have a sense of entitlement across the board. I don't know, how we are going to maintain our competitive edge when we now have these very insistent expectations of gender and race proportionality, say in the STEM fields, where you have Google now that is and YouTube ordering its recruiters to not even consider white male or Asian male engineers as entry-level hires in order to try and diversify their marketplace. We are turning our back on talent in the name of this racial and gender proportionality crusade, whereas China is pushing ahead full speed ahead, caring only about meritocracy, scientific accomplishment. They don't care. If a lab is all female and it's working on an Alzheimer's cure and those are the best scientists out there, by all means, bring it on. But if the best scientists for curing Alzheimer's happen to be overwhelmingly male, I really don't care.
Right.
But our national government now, the National Science Foundation, is pushing every single medical school and science department in this country to hire and promote by race and gender. This is a recipe for technological and scientific suicide.
Heather McDonald, author of the new book, The Diversity Delusion, and I appreciate your visit this week, Heather, and great. We could go on for another 2 hours on it, I'm sure. But download the book, and we got links up at tertiumquids.org. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate it.
Up next, Hans von Spakovsky from the Heritage Foundation on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Joining us now, back on the program from the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation, Senior Legal Fellow there, Hans von Spakovsky. Hans, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you, sir?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me back.
Have you ever seen a time when one elected official can bring such, what up heretofore had been arcane matters of American governance and history to, the front table of debate? I mean, like or dislike where he stands on things. When was the last time we had such raging debates on news desks about what jurisdiction meant in the 14th Amendment? Can you recall a time?
I don't. I mean, the media went crazy when Ronald Reagan became president, but I still don't even remember during his presidency these kind of debates going on.
Well, when did, and I must confess, I didn't know as much. I knew that the 14th Amendment wasn't simply the anchor baby one. It deals in, I think there are 4 parts to it at the end of the Civil War. But aside from addressing the 3/5 compromise, the debate that went back and forth and the recordings and the writings of all the men who debated both sides of the 14th Amendment were fascinating and illuminative and actually fairly concrete in how they viewed what the word jurisdiction, as it meant to these anyone whose children were born while under the jurisdiction of the United States, was pretty clear that it meant somebody who, owed allegiance to and participated in citizenship in the United States, not just happened to be here at the time. How is it we've gotten so murky over it?
I don't really know. I mean, this started apparently in the 1960s when the State Department started treating anyone who was born in the U.S. as a U.S. citizen, issuing passports and so forth. And I don't know if they just got sloppy. I don't know if it was some bureaucratic intentional policy because they wanted to change things. I don't know what it was. Mm-hmm. But it's very clear that people today who are arguing that the 14th Amendment provides citizenship to anyone born in the U.S., they can only say that because they're actually ignoring the language of the 14th Amendment, and they're ignoring, as you say, the clear legislative intent of the senators who came up with the amendment and discussed and debated it in the U.S. Senate in 1868.
Oh, it's one thing when we look at the Bill of Rights because there's not as much outside of the Federalist Papers to go on, but these are minutes recorded in floor debate, back and forth on what do you mean by jurisdiction? What does this mean? I mean, it's even a Supreme Court, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have to err on the side of jurisdiction means an actual citizen participating. I think they even bring up the fact that you would owe military service to the U.S. government and things that. Nobody who's just happened to be here, whether they cross from 6 countries of Central America on foot to get here or not, could claim.
No, and that's right, and that's where it's. If I give you a simple example, I think it's very easy for people. You don't have to be a lawyer to understand this. What the 14th Amendment says is you'll be considered a citizen if you're not only born in the United States, but you're subject to its jurisdiction. And by that, they meant subject to the complete and total jurisdiction of the U.S., not just partial or territorial jurisdiction. And the difference between the two, like I said, is easy to understand. Look, if a German tourist comes to the United States, he's subject to our territorial jurisdiction. If he breaks the law,
right.
If he walks into a bank in Charlottesville, he can be criminally prosecuted for that.
Sure, yes.
But he doesn't owe his political allegiance, and he's not within the complete jurisdiction of the U.S. because if, for example, we were to bring back the military draft, he can't be drafted and forced into the military. He can't be called for jury duty. If you're a citizen, you can be forced into jury duty. He can't vote. So he's not within the complete political jurisdiction of the U.S., the way a U.S. citizen is. And that applies to that German tourist, too, if it's a woman, and as soon as she gets here, she happens to have a baby on American soil. Why? Because that baby is a German citizen. It was born to a German citizen, so the child is a German citizen. It's the very same way that American kids who were born abroad, like my wife. My wife was actually born in the Philippines because her parents, who were U.S. citizens, were over there for business purposes. She's a U.S. citizen because she was born to U.S. parents. Same thing with the child of a German tourist who's born in the U.S. That child is a citizen of Germany and does not owe political allegiance to the U.S. and is not within the complete jurisdiction of the U.S. Therefore, they don't meet the terms of the 14th Amendment. They're not a U.S. citizen.
This was brought up in this, and thank you. I don't think it's been explained that clearly. Obviously, Hans, we need to get you on the speed dial of MSNBC and CNN. And, well, Don Lemon, you are a white male, so Don Lemon may be tracking you down anyway. But those points of orders. Anyway, it was reported that at some point there was a memorandum of understanding from the Obama administration that this was how they wanted the 14th Amendment and that that's what the president is seeking to undo. And in this case, does he need an executive order for this? Or does it just have to be a court case where potentially a Supreme Court justice has to write an opinion saying, no, this is what jurisdiction means and this is what the 14th Amendment applies to?
I think the president can do this through executive action. And that doesn't necessarily mean an executive order. He, as the head of the executive branch, can direct the State Department and say to them, you will abide by the exact language of the 14th Amendment and the federal statute on this. By the way, the federal statute just simply repeats the words, the 14th Amendment. He can say to the State Department, you will abide by this exact language, and you will only issue passports to individuals that are born in the U.S. and are subject to its jurisdiction. So he can do that. Now, you and I both know that as soon as he does that,
oh boy,
many, many lawsuits will be filed all over the country. They'll find some liberal judge who will enjoin the president, and it will go to the U.S. Supreme Court. And then it'll be up to the Supreme Court to say whether or not the president's interpretation of the 14th Amendment is the correct one. I think if they go according to its text and they go according to its legislative history, they'll agree with the president.
What I find fascinating is I can already hear the liberal members of Congress saying, "Well, the Supreme Court justices Gorsuch and I nearly said Kennedy again, Kavanaugh, will have to recuse themselves because they were appointed by this president when their own scion, FDR, how did he pack the Supreme Court just to get rulings he wanted?
Well, he threatened to pack it.
Threatened to, yes, yeah.
And once he threatened to pack it, all of a sudden the Supreme Court justices started changing their minds and ruling the way he wanted them.
It was funny how that happens. But it's interesting. We'll also probably hear the phrase en banc a lot in those cases, just in case they don't get the right judge shopped for them so that they can get up. Because one of the things you and I have talked about is the president has gotten quite a few lower court judges past the Senate and onto the courts. So there's a more likelihood of a conservative feel to even a lower court ruling, less some of these courts go en banc on this.
Right. Now, the other thing for folks to keep in mind is that, look, the Supreme Court has never actually ruled directly on point. Are the children of illegal aliens U.S. citizens? The only cases on this are very old. They're all from the late 1800s. And look, there's really two significant cases there that ought to be mentioned. The case that birthright citizen enthusiasts always point to is a case from 1898 called Wong Kim Ark.
Okay, I don't know so.
Yeah, that's a case where the U.S. refused re-entry to a guy who had been born in the U.S. and whose parents were Chinese permanent legal resident aliens. So they weren't U.S. citizens, but they were legally in the U.S. and they were permanent resident aliens. And in that case, the Supreme Court said, well, no, that child, having been born to permanent resident aliens, is a U.S. citizen. Now, I'll tell you, I think they misinterpreted the 14th Amendment in that decision, but that's a very narrow holding. That would only apply to people who are legally here and are permanent. It doesn't say anything about providing citizenship to the children of tourists,
right,
who are just here temporarily, and it certainly doesn't say anything about providing citizenship to illegal aliens. And look, there's a second case that demonstrates that that second condition, subject to jurisdiction, is really important. And it's another case from around the same time, 1884, called Elk v. Wilkins. And this was one where an American Indian sued the federal government saying, hey, I was born in the United States, therefore I should be considered a citizen, because American Indians were not considered citizens of the United States under the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court said, no, you are not a U.S. citizen. Why? Yes, you were born in the United States, but you owe your political allegiance to your tribal government. Therefore, you don't meet the second condition. Therefore, you are not a U.S. citizen. And American Indians didn't become citizens until 1924, when Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act. There would have been no need for Congress to pass that law making American Indian citizens if every individual born in the U.S. gets citizenship.
Interesting. That's a great way to put it. You're hired when this does come to court. Hans von Spakovsky from the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. So, what should the president do with however many of these El Salvadoran and Honduran hikers when they get to the border? It's been suggested, setting up a FEMA camp, call it Ellis Island 2, adjudicate, but the president's made it fairly clear that he's sensitive to the folks who have been waiting sometimes a decade to get their citizenship done, and he's not going to let just people cut the line because they're here. So what do you think the best case scenario for these hikers are?
If I was president, which of course will never happen, I would seriously consider about, frankly, closing the border completely for some period of time. Two reasons for that. One, you want to prevent all of these thousands of aliens from getting into the United States, getting across the border, and getting into our administrative court system, which will allow them to, unfortunately, disappear into the interior of the country while their cases are being processed. And second, it was a way of putting pressure on the Mexican government to stop this. The Mexican government isn't doing anything to prevent these aliens from traveling north to the border. They're not returning them across their southern border. In fact, they seem to be facilitating by providing all kinds of resources for them. They're facilitating them traveling through Mexico and getting to the U.S. border, and their pressure needs to be put on them. The other thing that the president, I think, ought to do is basically say none of these individuals will be considered for asylum if they make that claim. The reason being that they are traveling through Mexico. If they have a legitimate asylum claim, they have an obligation to make that asylum claim in Mexico.
That would be the first border they crossed.
Exactly right. If you are Honduran and you are claiming that you need asylum because you're being persecuted by the Honduran government for your political opinions, political beliefs, you can't credibly claim that you fear persecution from the Mexican government. So if you don't claim asylum in Mexico, that tells us that you have no credible asylum claim. And therefore, the president, I think, ought to say none of these individuals will even be considered for asylum.
Is there international law that we can point to that would back us up in that claim?
Yes. For example, liberals who do they always point to as saying, "Oh, these are the government entities we ought to follow." The European Union, right? The European Union has a pact. It's called the Dublin Regulation, and it says that any alien coming into the European Union who wants to claim asylum has to do so in the first country of the EU they get into.
Wow. Okay. So there is precedent on this legally.
Absolutely is, and we have such an agreement with Canada. Mexico has refused to enter into an agreement with us, but that doesn't prevent us from enforcing our own immigration law, and that allows us to say we won't grant asylum to individuals who don't assert asylum in third countries they pass through that have, asylum procedures. And by the way, Mexico passed a very broad asylum law in 2011. In fact, it's broader than the American law.
Well, I recall a story from a few years ago, and Hans, you and I may have discussed it on this program, the case of the Marine that was looking for some, borderline legal way to ease the pain of his PTSD and his wounds, wound up in Mexico, was traveling parts of, I guess, El Paso, wound up on the wrong side of the border. And spent, I think, 2 years in Mexican prison because of their strict immigration laws. So even more so makes me scratch my head over these folks. If one American Marine can spend 2 years in Mexican jail over that, these folks just seem to have flaunted that whole policy.
They have, and unfortunately, the Mexican government has been very complicit in facilitating the entry of folks from Central and South America passing through Mexico illegally and going to the U.S. border, and they don't do anything to stop Mexican citizens from leaving Mexico and going into the U.S. The government there, I think, sees it as a safety valve. If folks leave and go to the U.S.,
one less.
That helps the Mexican economy, because you know what the second biggest source of income is in Mexico? It's remittances sent from the U.S. by Mexican citizens back to Mexico.
Oh my God, second biggest? That's crazy. Yeah. So let me ask you this then, Hans. Finishing up on the issue is the discussion over who's funding all this, whether it's Venezuela or the Tides Foundation or where these buses are coming from. Are these the El Salvadoran communists who are mad because their boss just got voted out of office? Is that too much in the weeds, and are we diluting the discussion rather than just having it simply on the facts as you've laid them out here so far?
I actually think we ought to do both.
Okay.
I mean, we've got to deal with the issue of thousands of aliens headed for our border with the intention of illegally crossing it. But if this is being organized by private groups, if it's being organized by government entities, we need to know about it, because that is a foreign policy issue that needs to be dealt with by the president. And for example, look, I have no idea whether a foreign government has any involvement in this. If they do, that's the kind of thing where the U.S. ought to be thinking about sanctions or other penalties against any foreign government entities that are involved in this.
It was also brought up that from a humanitarian side, we used to be the country that helped people who found their own governments to be less than free and liberty-minded to try to win those countries over. Can we ever regain that place where we're that shining city on the hill that helps shine the light of freedom into these countries, rather than just say, hey, once it turns bad there, you can get out and come here?
Look, I think that's a very important issue, and I don't think we can be a shining city on a hill, a great democracy, if we can't maintain our sovereignty and can't maintain control of our borders.
Well, we're certainly not doing a great example of showing democracy at its work. Mob rule seems to be what one political party seems to be wanting to use over another. So, Hans, I appreciate that. And again, can people go to heritage.org and read more about what I know you have a column up on Breitbart.com as well on this subject, and research more of the 14th Amendment and some of these things, so that at the water cooler or when somebody is hollering about it at Thanksgiving, they can, share some of this fact with them?
Yeah, in fact, if they go to the Daily Signal, that's the electronic newspaper that the Heritage Foundation puts out, we have a series of the most important kind of bullet points that outline the 14th Amendment and how it was passed and the cases that you and I just talked about. Plus, I do have an article up at Fox News about this that came out yesterday.
It's important stuff, because I think the rhetoric of do we care for people is obscuring what that care actually looks like, and that's the sad thing is that we get so caught up in this, and there may be truly humanitarian issues that are either being suborned for political reasons or just not being seen because of the politics of it all, and the law really is supposed to be there to help that. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I think it's totally fair.
Hans von Spakovsky, Heritage Foundation, thank you again for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for listening this week. And for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, please remember that Tuesday is Election Day. And if you haven't already, and we've seen statistics that lead me to believe that upwards of 20 to 25% of all the votes cast in the 2014 midterm have already been cast via absentee early submission of ballots. That's a stunning number, and we may see historical turnouts across the Commonwealth of Virginia as well as up and down the United States as the midterms can. Will it be a blue wave? Will it be a red wave? Or will it just be rearranging the deck chairs on the cruise ship you choose? I mean, you can choose the Titanic if you want. There are certainly people who would make a decent case that, given the deficits we run, that's where we are. But please make sure that if you have not voted yet, that you are ready to go Tuesday. You know where your polling places are. The Board of Elections in your communities, whether it be Lynchburg, Roanoke, Charlottesville, or anywhere across the Commonwealth of Virginia. Make sure you know that the polling places. Make sure you bring your identification with you and are ready to go. And if I may suggest, contact your local party officials, either one, anyone, or just contact your registrars if you can volunteer to help on Election Day. There are certainly plenty of folks who could use your help on what could be a very, very high turnout midterm election coming here. This message just in predicate. Certainly by the time you and I get together next weekend, we'll know whether it was just a rearranging of the chairs or if there are some stunning changes in Washington, D.C. coming in January. Until next weekend across the Commonwealth, for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish. Thanks for all the fish. Thanks for